right, so good afternoon and welcome to the Writing Lab for American Masters. We will be starting here today at 3.3.1. So if you are not quite there yet, you are allowed to go through and make a document that says Writing Lab on it, and then submit this for every assignment up until 3.3.1. Now, I want to make this clear because it was not in this class, but in another class, a student thought that Writing Lab means you're excused from doing the assignments. And that is not true. You do need to go back and do them. But the reason that we want you to get up to the writing assignment is because that and the peer review are the only two assignments that get deducted points if it comes in late. So this way you have the opportunity to turn in the essay on time, and then you can go back and make up the assignments. Plus, after we've talked about it, it's going to be a little bit easier. In fact, we're going to go over a couple of the assignments today that several people had trouble with. So you'll be able to go back and resubmit those. So here we go. So here is your prompt. This is what you'll be asked to respond to. In order to start a revolution, people must be persuaded to give up the routine of their lives, no matter how bad. Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson were each instrumental in their own way to help persuade the colonists to engage in an almost impossible war to win. Write an informative essay that describes what each man did and how he did it to turn the hearts of the colonists toward the American Revolution. So, what I want to start with first is a new concept that actually will become very important to you as a senior. And this is one that the colleges are really pushing, and it's kind of a complicated concept. So I want to plant the seed now and then have you learn a little bit more, so that by the time you get to college, you have it. You'll be ahead of all of your colleagues there. So Kairos is basically the situation as it is. It's the time, location, and the way people are interacting in a social situation. It's also known as exigence. That's why I got something up there that looks like an egg, although it's exigence. When you figure that people interact, things happen on a day-to-day basis, then at some point there comes a conflict. And in that conflict, there's a problem that needs to be solved. That need is the exigence. What needs response to it? And so what somebody does in order to try and solve the problem, especially if it has to be done collectively, is first find out what the facts. What do we know about what's going on? That, of course, is logos. You also need to know who has the best information on this. Is this something that you have to interview somebody for? Is there experiments that have to be done? Personal experience also counts as ethos. Who has the best information to address this problem? And then finally, it's pathos. How does everyone feel about this situation? So all of these are contained within what's called the rhetorical situation. And so if we look at the rhetorical situation of what these men were up against, back when the colonists simply wanted to extend the reach of the British Empire to the North American continent. And so they came, they took land and they started cultivating it. They made little cities, they started working. For whatever reason, King George III decided that, this is another source of income. And so he taxed them. Well, the thing is, if you're in a new place and all you're really doing is working your own land, you don't have money. The only trade you do is with what you grow or what you make. And so it was unfair. And so what had to happen, it got so bad that they had to decide, should we go up against a very powerful enemy to separate ourselves from that tyranny? That was the whole Kairos of the situation. When you are trying to solve that problem, it becomes a matter of juggling. And it's using those three forms of argument in such a way that you can persuade people to change their mind about something, to follow you in something, to help create a solution to a problem, or to try and calm the issue down. So that's why we have you look at the rhetoric of these men. How did these men use their words in order to persuade the colonists? So the first one we want to look at is Patrick Henry. And if you go to page 120, I realize I did not give you the very information you needed in some of these. If you take a moment to read about Patrick Henry on page 120, then we can kind of look at what we need to look at next. So go ahead and take a moment and read page 120 about Patrick Henry. I can see if anybody came. Oh, just down. So I find that the best tool to use when you're trying to find out the Kairos rhetorical situation is to do the soapstone. And um, we did do one of these, I believe, before in the first module, I think, or the second. I know we've done them. But what this does is it helps you figure out what the situation is and why this particular person had a particular message and what he did with it. So looking at the information from page 120, what do we know about Patrick Henry? What was his first occupation?
Storekeeping?
He did help with that, yes. But
Traveling
then,
preacher?
huh?
A traveling preacher?
Traveling preacher, yes. He later became, he later became a lawyer. And he was chosen to represent the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now, Burgesses were kind of like our city council members or board members. They represented a certain area of people, and so Virginia was divided into several of these small little, almost like individual counties, and they each were led by a Burgess. And so, in his segment, he was chosen to represent the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now, when you look at the occasion, note what it says on page 120. He's writing this speech after the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was kind of like a protest against these intolerable acts where the tea was taxed. Again, it comes back to how is somebody supposed to pay money when they don't have any money? They're supposed to be relying on Britain to give them the supplies that they don't have in their own country. And so the colonists, and especially these Burgesses, just kind of kept taking it and taking it and taking it and taking it. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. So that was the occasion. So the audience is the Virginia Convention. They were trying to address what was going on, what they needed to do in order to appease the British rulers. And at that point, in fact, if you look, it said on March 23rd, 1775, after several delegates of the Virginia House of Burgesses gave speeches in favor of compromising with the British, Henry rose to defend his resolution to take up arms against Britain. As the speech reached its climax, Henry is said to have grabbed an ivory letter opener and plunged it toward his chest as he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Kind of sounds a little over dramatic myself, but that's what they needed. Okay, so what is the speech about? What is its subject? Oh, we skipped. No, I got the R's. It's purpose. It's the purpose I skipped. Well, purpose and subject are the same thing here in this. What is this all about? What's he giving a speech for?
He doesn't want the tax to be on the TV and on the...
He didn't want that, yes, but is that the purpose of this?
Freedom?
Nope.
Liberty?
I just read it.
Liberty.
Huh?
He wants liberty. Liberty.
Yeah, that's kind of like a side note there. What is the purpose of his speech? It says it right there in that paragraph with March 23rd.
He wants to make a compromise?
No, he wants the exact opposite. The other speeches were the ones who were saying we need to compromise, we need to find a way to appease the British. He rose to defend his resolution to take up arms. What does that mean? We talked about resolutions in the first module with that one. To be resolved to do something is a proposal to do something. He wants the colonists to go to war with the British. That's what the whole purpose is, and that's what the subject is. He needs to persuade the other Burgesses to encourage the people that are under them to go to war. Now, when we look at, and it was because the British rule was unfairly treating the colonists. But when you look at that, give me liberty or give me death, and you look at the rest of this, what would you say about the tone? What was his tone? So we're looking for adjectives here. How would you describe it? Well, if you turn on page 122, let me just read the first part of it, and then maybe you can hear the tone better. Mr. President, no man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as abilities of the very worthy gentlemen who have just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights, and therefore I hope that it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs. I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery, and in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate.
He sounds upset.
He is upset. He's very upset. And what are some of the words that kind of add to that tone?
And he said, this question before the House is one of awful moments.
An awful, yes. Very good. Awful moment. Kirsten, can you find one that kind of shows how angry he is in that section that I... And Emma, can you find something that looks, that the way he says it, you know he's upset?
This is no time for ceremony.
Can you say that a little louder, please?
This is no time for ceremony.
This is no time for ceremony. Exactly. Now, in and of itself, it may not sound like very much, but when you look at the other sentences around it, he's kind of apologizing at the beginning. And he's hoping he's not disrespectful. But he's going to speak now. This is no time for ceremony. You know, you can see it kind of build up to that. Very good. Did you find something?
No, I didn't.
One of the things that the disrespectful part, definitely, I hope I will not be thought disrespectful if my opinion's opposite to theirs. I mean, it's kind of, well, I don't know. If you were sitting there and you knew that you stood no chance against the British government, and this guy is wanting you to tell your subjects that we need to go to war in order to get this to stop, and he comes up here and says basically to you, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I see this as completely opposite. Is that going to work for you?
Not really.
Maybe. It all depends on that Kairos, doesn't it? Especially if they've been listening to speech after speech after speech of should we go to war or not, and they're all saying no, we shouldn't. We're going to get defeated. We can't summon up an army that can defeat the British. And then he gets up there and he says, excuse me, but I see differently. So it really is meant to kind of say, you're not seeing this in the right light. I think by saying he doesn't want to be thought disrespectful, I think by saying that up front, he tries to minimize that. So, okay. So those are just some of the, if we're looking at the rhetorical situation, again, it has to be the fact that it's these men who are trying to say, no, we can't do this, we can't do this. And he's coming around saying, we have to do it. We have no choice. What are some of the other things, if you look through the speech, what are some of the things he says that you believe are persuasive that turn this around? Because remember, the result of this is they go ahead and vote to bring up an army. So what are some of the things that you think in this were successful in persuading? I'll write them down. Go further than what I read too, because that was just his introduction.
Wait, what do we have to look for? What do we look for?
Well, here, let me give you one. If you go down towards the bottom of 122, He says, should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason toward my country. Remember that, oops, that's gulling. Guilty of treason toward my country. Now remember that by saying to King George, we no longer respect your monarchy, that is treason. And everybody who signed the Declaration of Independence could have been taken back to Britain and executed for their treason. So what he's saying here is it's more treasonous if they don't act on the offensive. And so what he's really trying to say here is that, look, the treason lies not with us and what we're doing, but what he has done to us. And it's treasonous to us if we don't act. Okay. What would be some other things that
Would on page 123, ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with these warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land.
And what is he basically saying there?
He's saying that
Lost.
is he saying that like they have the stuff to go to war, like they're prepared, they just need to like go to the war because they have everything ready.
Right.
They don't really need his approval.
Exactly. Because they've been able to do it for themselves. So ask yourselves, keep losing it because it's right in the middle of the page.
Yeah.
How this gracious reception of our petition. Oh, how this gracious. How this. Sorry. How this gracious reception of our petition. Right. Look at how he's treating us. He is not treating us with the respect that we as subjects should have. Okay. Can we come up with a couple of others?
Page 125. These are the implements of war and subjection, the last argument to which kings resort.
Okay,
it's the first little sentence on top, next to ourselves. 125.
135, I'm there.
No, 125.
125, right? Yeah. I'm there. These are
the implements of war.
a little louder.
These are the implements of war and subjection.
Okay.
The last arguments to which kings resort.
Good. And you said it's towards the top?
Yes, all the way at the top.
All the way at the top. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
I'm looking in the wrong paragraph. These are the implements of war. Very good. And if we look at the three balls we're juggling, what would you say this one might be?
Isn't it? Is it logos?
Yeah. How can we not act this way when this is how we are being treated? He has declared war on us. What we need to do is fight back. So yeah, that's definitely logos. Okay, one more. Remember the ones that I had you look at in particularly the literary devices? Do you remember what one of those is?
For what?
Do you remember the ones about metaphor or illusion?
Mhm.
You remember one of those?
Let me see if I think I did. For illusion,
Mm-hmm.
for mine, I did suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss.
Betrayed with a kiss. Very good. Where does that come from? Because that is an illusion. Do you know where that comes from? It's actually a biblical reference. That is when the betrayed with a kiss is talking about Judas in order to identify Jesus to the Roman soldiers. So he said, "I will kiss the man who you seek," and that's what so that is a biblical reference. Henry knew that the majority of the men in this conference were Christian men who knew the Bible. And there's a couple of references there because that's not the only one. The other one that is an allusion to that is the lamp at the feet, the lamp of the feet of experience. That also can be considered an allusion. Speaking of those, in fact, I'm going to change slide order here because now that we've addressed them, I want to go ahead and put them up here where they are because the figurative language is meant to persuade. Move them up, move them up, move them up, 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 up. There we go. Okay. And I know that a lot of you had trouble with this one. So we want to make sure that we understand the metaphors and the illusions. So the literary illusion has to come from another already written source. So in this part where he says we are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of the siren till she transforms us into beasts. This is a literary illusion. Do you know the source that it came from? If you were in freshman English, there's a good chance, with me, you should know it. There's a good chance in your other freshman class you may have read that part too. Emma, does this sound familiar to you?
It's from Greek mythology.
Excellent. It is from actually the Odyssey. And remember, if you read the Odyssey when you were a freshman, this is the part where Odysseus cautions his men from going to the island of Circe because what does Circe do? She turns the men into animals. And so that's what Henry's illusion is. He's saying that this is what the British are doing to us. They're turning us into beasts of burden. They're turning us into animals. So that's why it would be effective at this point. By the way, the give me liberty or give me death, some people were using that as the literary illusion, and I could see why. If you use it today, like if somebody's, trying to say, we should have at least 5 more minutes at lunchtime because we don't have enough time to eat. Give me liberty or give me death. Then that becomes an illusion because Patrick Henry said it first. But you can't use the illusion at the moment Patrick Henry says it himself. So that can't be an illusion because nobody's alluding to it because he said it first. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So the metaphor. Now, again, this could be either metaphor or illusion depending on your knowledge. It all depends on, are you familiar with the source? If you're not familiar with the source, this can still be used as a metaphor. So the lamp by which my feet are guided is the lamp of experience. So what two things that are not usually alike, what is being compared to each other?
We are guided by light.
So the lamp, and is it being compared to what? No. Experience, right. Yeah. So light, experience, that's the metaphor there. What about this? Well, we already talked about that one. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed by a kiss. We know that's an illusion, but again, if you don't know the illusion, I'm not sure if this becomes a metaphor that would be really useful. Is it useful to know what the illusion is? If you are not familiar with the Bible story of Judas betraying Christ with a kiss, does this make any sense now? What I'm saying is that I think sometimes illusions can work, but if you don't know the reference, it's really hard to make them work. So what device is this one? They are sent over to bind and rivet us upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. Is that a metaphor or an illusion?
Metaphor?
Mm-hmm. So if it's a metaphor, what two things are being compared which are not alike?
They want to hold them back with chains.
Okay. And so if we were to look, and the information is really helpful from page 120, what would be considered the chains from the information on 120?
Would it be the Tea Party?
What led to it, for sure. It's the Stamp Act. Between the Stamp Act and what the colonists were calling the intolerable acts, it's those intolerable acts that become the chains that the British forge. Alrighty. So what do these types of figurative language, or how do these types of figurative language impact the listener? Why is he using all these metaphors and allusions to the men of the Virginia Convention?
So that it could create an image in their head of how they feel.
Mm-hmm. That's the magic of rhetoric, especially when you're taking metaphors or allusions. You're taking two things and showing the relationship between them. It happens on a deeper level in your brain. And so that's how it can have an impact on these men. All right, so let's look at Thomas Paine. If you go to 130, go ahead and take a moment to read the information about who Thomas Paine was. And why he wrote The Crisis. Give you about one more minute. Okay, so what's important to know about the speaker, Thomas Paine himself? What do we know about him?
He was poorly educated.
Okay.
He was the son of a corset maker.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in England.
Mm-hmm.
And he spent his first 37 years in like drifting through various occupations.
Okay. What is the most important thing to understand about the kind of person he is? Of all those facts in that first paragraph, what's the most important to understand when it comes to this Kairos?
He wanted higher pay, like he wanted to get paid higher.
Right. He wants to be one of the first to start a union. And I don't know if you know too much about unions, but there are people who really like them and people who really hate them. And it all has to do with your point of view. If you create a union, you make everybody equal and deserving of equal pay. Sometimes that's a good idea, sometimes it's not. In this case, for him, it was bad because the British said, "Oh no, not around here, you're not." And so, yeah, and he was once a tax collector too, but he was fired for trying to organize the workers as a union, and now he becomes a journalist and a publisher. And that fact that he was able to mass produce uh, these pamphlets made him kind of like the natural voice to the people. Okay, what is the occasion for writing the crisis number one? What is the rhetorical situation?
They were not paid like he wasn't paid enough money.
No, it's the fact that he wanted people to have more money, that was back in Britain. This has to do with right now why he writes. Well, let's do this. When did he write it? When did he write? Um, Crisis number one comes from Common Sense. When was that written?
In January 1776.
Mm-hmm. Here's what happens. Okay, actually, that was right before. Um, in December, you've got to realize that the Continental Army only had the weapons they could come with. It's not like they could enlist and then they gave them uniforms and then they gave them guns and they gave them grenades and all like that. They didn't have those. So men who needed to fight the war had to come with all that they had. The clothes on their back, the muskets that they might have owned, swords, daggers, whatever they had, that's what they could fight with. Whereas the British were a well-funded army. In December, there's going to be a lot of snow. There's a lot of snow back then. It's cold. They're sick. They're hungry because that was the other thing. They hardly had any food. They had to bring the food with them. Um, and they were fighting this army that could be refreshed and that was well armed. They were very discouraged. So he writes it during that winter so that it can be distributed specifically to the men in the Continental Army, but then also to their families. And that's who the audience becomes. So he is writing directly to the people who are fighting for this war. So then what becomes the purpose of writing it? Why does he write this pamphlet?
So that the soldiers keep on going and not be discouraged about what's happening to them at the moment.
Right. He needs to bring them up. He needs to encourage them. He needs to give them hope that they can overcome this. And that's also part of the subject. He says we have to defeat it. Tyranny must be defeated. And he's also telling them who's going to help them. Who defeats tyranny? God does. He'll bring that in a lot. This is something that because we are on the side of right, that we will be given the ability to win. So let's take a look at one of the tone that he has. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service. That's how he starts this. Actually, he starts it with, these are the times that try men's souls. How would you describe the tone there? Oh, gosh, it's sorry about that. Is this the same tone as Patrick Henry's?
Yeah, it was you wanted to like give them hope.
Okay, so, but is that going to be the same as, because remember what we said about Patrick Henry, he was actually angry. Is Thomas Paine angry?
No, I don't think so.
No, because it's not going, if anything, he knows that the soldiers are angry. So what he needs to do is he needs to change the tone so that he can be more uplifting, more hopeful. But he is kind of appealing to their ego here. Because what does it mean, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot? Do you know what that means? In summer, it's a lot easier to fight a war. It's hard to fight a war when you're, knee deep in snow. You don't have warm enough clothes. You don't have enough food. You don't have enough provisions in terms of um, arms. But in the summer, it's a lot easier because you don't have to deal with all those extra problems. Same thing with Sunshine Patriot. When everything is good, the sun is shining, and you're out there and you're fighting. It's easy to feel hopeful and capable. But these guys are in the middle of winter. So what he's saying is that, the men who have it easy will naturally be the ones who shrink away from service. Yeah.
Why did they fight in the winter? Why didn't they wait? So it was warmer.
That's how, well, part of the reason they fought in the winter was that they declared it too late. Remember when they declared independence? It was in July. So it's going to take them time to build up the army. By the time they get to fighting, now it's winter. In fact, Patrick Henry makes reference to that, I think earlier on, or is it Patrick? It's either Thomas Paine or Patrick Henry who says, okay, maybe we should have done this a little bit sooner. Maybe it is Patrick Henry or Thomas Paine who says that. Trying to remember where it is. But he one of them does say, look, we should have done this earlier. If they had declared independence in January, then they could be fighting the war in the summer, and that would have been easier. But that's not when it happened. We're in the situation we are in now. Part of the reason that had to be delayed was because it was so hard to get everybody to agree. And as we move into Thomas Jefferson, that's what you'll see. That the actual declaration took weeks to convince everybody that, because they had to have a majority vote. And at the very first vote, they didn't have it. So it took them a while to convince everybody that this needed to be done. And by the time they're all ready to go, it's not the best time in the world. So the rhetorical situation now becomes different. Now we've got, discouraged men who need encouragement. They need the locker room speech at halftime. And so, what are some of the things that Thomas Paine says that you think would be encouraging to those men? There it is. It is Thomas Paine. I'm looking at page 133, and it's in the middle of the first full paragraph at the top there. We did not make a proper use of last winter, neither could we, while we were in the dependent state. However, the fault, if there were one, was all our own. We have no one to blame but ourselves. Okay, I'll write that down. What is something else?
Page 133, the second paragraph.
Okay.
The first long sentence after the comma where it says that God Almighty will not give up on a people to military destruction or leave them unsupportedly to perish.
Well, okay. Oops. Destruction, is it? Yeah. Okay, one more.
Page 135, the second half of the right side of the line in the middle.
Okay.
It says that God may bless you. It matters not where you live or what you rank of life. You will hold the evil or blessing will reach you all. The first.
The very top part where it says that God may bless you?
Yeah.
Okay. And notice this actually becomes show your faith by work. That's in the Bible. So that's a literary allusion right there. Show your faith by works. That God may bless you. Good. Okay. And it works. It takes a while. It takes about 2.5 years and the help of the French to get the men going on there. One of the things that a lot of people had trouble with too was 3.2.5. That's where you had the painting and this quote by Thomas Paine. And a lot of people seem to think that that's Thomas Paine in the boat, and it's not. If you look at the title, it's George Washington crossing the Delaware. And if you look carefully at that picture, there's a lot of clues in that. The picture gives a message. What are some of the things you notice in that picture?
The ice.
Right. Remember, we're talking about fighting in the winter. And so the ice in the Delaware there shows the extra obstacles, that this is going to be even harder because there's obstacles in the environment that's going to slow them down. What else do you notice?
How who was it in the picture?
George Washington.
How George Washington is standing
right.
Proudly.
Yes. You know, he's got that knee up, the shoulders are back, his head is up. And notice how that fits in with the quote then. O ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. And you can almost hear, stand up straight, stand forth. And that's what George Washington is doing. And so this also was used as an encouragement to the Continental Army because it was hard. And here you notice that the men are kind of, well, they're not rags necessarily. They certainly don't look warm enough for the season. George Washington himself has a cape. Other than that, the men are just really wearing maybe a couple layers of shirts and some scarves, but they're not really appropriately dressed. I find that ironic when you look at the picture on page 134 in your textbook, and you see that this is a painting by Mort Künstler, The World Turned Upside Down. What's different between those two pictures?
This one is on dry land.
Yep.
There's no ice.
Right.
And the people are well dressed.
Yep.
And they have horses and what is that, drums?
Yep.
Drums.
In fact, there's a whole lot more of them than there are in the guys in the red coats, right? Yeah. So in itself, we're looking at kind of some propaganda here. The picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware is probably more suited for who that audience was. This painting was done in, I wonder when this painting was actually done. It says 2006, but I don't know if that's when the print was allowed. But it's different. So the connection between the two of these is that it is George Washington standing forth, and George Washington represents the leadership of the Continental Army, and as leading these other men, these men love mankind and are going to fight the tyrant. That's what the connection is between those two. Okay, let's take a look at Thomas Jefferson now. On page 138, you have a biography of him. So go ahead and read through that real quickly, and then we'll look at the soapstone of Thomas Jefferson. Can you see any differences right now between Jefferson and then Paine and Henry? What would be kind of the primary difference between Jefferson and the other two?
He did a lot of stuff. He went to college. He became president, vice president. He became U.S. He served. He did everything.
And I think the most important part of what you said is that he grew up educated. Now, yes, he lost his father at the age of 14, but his father was a landowner. He inherited that land. He inherited the wealth of that land, and that allowed him to become well educated. And it's because of that education, and of course he also is a Burgess for Virginia, but that's probably why they asked him to write the Declaration of Independence. So that's the occasion. They finally get the vote where they know they're going to have to separate from Britain. Somebody's got to write the Dear John letter or the Dear King George letter. And that's most probably why he is the one chosen, because he does have the college education.
Better words too.
Yeah. Which in the long run is a good thing, except later on, as we shall see, when the Continental Congress is having him edit some of this stuff out, he gets a little upset. Okay, so the occasion is he's the one drafted to actually write the DOI. So who is the audience? We talked about this the first time we looked at this, but who is the audience of the Declaration of Independence? We forgot already? Who do they need to tell? We quit.
The
Hmm?
king.
The king. This is for King George III. Now, in addition to that, Congress is the one who's going to need, since they're signing it, it has to be their voices too. So it's sort of kind of like to them as well, and the colonists, because the men of the Congress represent those people. But King George is the primary audience of this document. And what is its purpose?
To tell him how unfair he's been treating.
Right.
people.
Because he's being such a lousy ruler, the colonies are now saying, we will be independent from ourselves, we will govern ourselves. We no longer listen to you. That's the whole purpose of it. Now, yes, it says we want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you look at, especially when we looked at this before, how Abraham Lincoln said that this was actually an unnecessary statement for what it did at the time. They didn't need to say that at the time. I think if Lincoln had been in the room at that time, he would have said, I want this part struck out unless you plan on freeing the slaves. And I think there was some part of that discussion. And in fact, we're going to look and see one of those changes. Okay, so subject is just basically related to the purpose. Because the king refused to treat the colonists as full British subjects, they would elect their own government. Now the tone. Okay, you did read the Declaration of Independence before, but what is interesting about what's in your textbook is that it's Jefferson's own opinions about the document that he wrote. He also showed what edits were made by the team of 5. There were 5 men who worked on that draft. And so he is saying there's 2 tones in this. One tone of the DOI itself, and then there's the tone of what he thinks about the changes that they made. So listen to this. As the sentiments of men are known not only by what they receive, but what they reject also, I will state the form of the DOI as originally reported. What does that sound like to you?
Sounds like he wants people to know his side of the story.
Yeah, they were important words. I want you to know what I really said. To me, it's kind of like he's been spoiled all his life. You know, he lost his dad. That's a horrible thing, age of 14, and he has to learn that responsibility. But he was well educated. He had everything he needed and wanted. And now there's a tyrant that must be defeated. And he's done wrong. And now the Congress is saying, dial it back, Tom. It's a little too strong. So if we let's take a look on page 141 at just the first change. So remember that the changes are underlined. And then off to the side is what now is in the Declaration of Independence. So when they say, we hold these truths that they are endowed by their creator, Thomas Jefferson says, with inherent and inalienable rights. The Congress struck it and put in certain instead. Why do you think that happened?
Because not everybody, inherits
Right.
what he had.
In fact, this is a very monotheistic viewpoint in which, and this Jefferson was influenced by a strong religion, and so he truly believed that this was they were on a mission from God. And the congressmen are saying, no, we're just trying to break away from something that's unfair. So they're going to dial back the devotion and the theism that is really in the document. So a lot of the stuff you see that's being changed is because they want some of the religion dialed back. Let's take a look at page 142. And so there's a really long statement there that's underlined. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of unremitting injuries and usurpations, among which appears no solitary fact to contradict the uniform tenor of the rest. Why do you think they took that out? Do you know what it means? I don't either. I really don't know what it means. And this is my life as an English teacher sometimes. Sometimes a student will just say, this sounds wonderful, and they'll write it out, and I'm like, can you tell me what you just said? And I have a feeling that's why they struck it, because they looked at each other, what's he saying? I don't know. You know what he's saying? No, I don't know. So all they did was say repeated. And in fact, he especially when you get to the list, they've pretty much left the list alone, haven't they? So it's kind of like he just did it a lot. That's all we need to say. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, for the truth of which we pledge a faith that but yet unsullied by falsehood. That's kind of a combination between the two. It's kind of like dialing back the religion, and I don't know what that says really. So if we look at this as a whole, why did Congress want parts of the DOI edited out? And this is actually one of the questions and the activities that you just did. So what did they edit out?
Things that sounded unneeded and inappropriate for the things they were trying to write.
Right. They needed the parts that talked too much about God, kind of calm down. They had to be careful about what they accused the king of doing. And so there's certain verbs. In fact, you'll see on 143, they changed suffered the administration of justice to obstructed the administration of justice. And so that to them was a little bit calmer, because you are accusing the king of doing all of these acts, and in accusing him, you are acting treasonously. Okay. So how did Jefferson feel about Congress's edits? What did he call them?
Called for?
He used a very specific word in talking about what they cut out. Where'd it go? It's actually in the description. It's in the build background.
mutilation.
Mutilations. There we go. Oh, come on, Tom. Um, I mean, that's strong. That's strong. So he was pretty much offended by what they did to his document. And sometimes I wonder if that's not how students see me sometimes. You know, when you write that first draft and you think, this is wonderful, I put so much time and effort into it, and then I come along and your peer comes along and we both put stuff in it, and you're like, I thought it was better than that. And I have a feeling he was just a little grouchy when it came to that. So, how would you describe the beliefs and values of the delegates based on what they accepted or rejected? Remember what we talked about. If they're taking out the parts that are too strong religiously, that may be over um, insulting to King George. I mean, what is it they wanted this document to be that they didn't see fully in the draft that Jefferson came up with? You're about to sign your name to a document that can get you killed. Really, all of these men became wanted men after they signed this document. But in their own minds, they needed it justified so that they were not committing treason. Jefferson's words were probably a little bit too strong, especially since he's bringing this in from a religious background. He gets a little carried away. The delegates are making a legal document, and it's good for us because as a legal document it becomes objective rather than subjective. The king was wrong in what he did, but that's all they need to say. Because you were wrong in what you did, we are breaking off from it. So they needed a document that was objective rather than mostly subjective. So how would you define the Kairos of this historic event? What's being juggled here? I think what's hard for us to imagine, and actually I've been seeing a lot of the behavior right now and thinking how many childish adults there are in this country. Um, Whether you like President Trump or not, there's a lot of people overreacting in both directions. This whole business of trying to impeach the president. Did he do wrong? I don't know. I do know that we've got an election coming up. We get to decide again if he stays or goes. The kairos of the situation that happened then is not what's happening now, except for specific groups of people. I think when you look at specifically the immigration issue, there's there are people that things are happening to that should not be happening. This business of separating children from their parents. I mean, I don't care what you know. Are you here legally, not legally? Doesn't matter. Do not separate children from their parents. It makes no sense at all. So, but I don't think we could ever understand what this must have been like because we have so much now as a result of these freedoms. Um, we have the ability to speak our minds and not be accused of treason. Um, if if the people who are saying bad things about Trump were back in this time saying those things to the King George, they would have been dead. They would have been executed. But we can say what we want today. So the historic event that happened was that these very poor, low educated, simple people took up arms against a mighty hand in one. I don't know if we'd ever be in that situation. So it's kind of hard to, it is hard to define that rhetorical situation if you have never been there, if you've never understand that. Okay, so back to the essay prompt. Um, you're going to write an informative essay that describes what each of the three men did and how he did it to turn the hearts of the colonists towards the American Revolution. And so let's break down what you need to do. The first task is to summarize the style of each writer. What is the Kairos? And basically, what that means is all that soapstone stuff. That's what the Kairos is. Who is the audience? What was the purpose? What was the occasion? How did the writer or speaker need to handle that situation? The next thing you need to do is what appeals did they use to persuade the colonists to go to war? So, like we've said that with Patrick Henry, he has kind of this mixture of pathos and logos that he's giving towards these men who've already spoken and have said, we can't fight, we're never going to win. Thomas Paine, on the other hand, is trying to be encouraging. And so he's going to rely more on the ethos of faith in God that will drive these, that plus the pathos as well. Look and see how much logos he actually uses, because with the simple people, except for the logos where everybody believes and knows the same thing, that's also considered logos. He's going to rely mostly on ethos and pathos there. And then Jefferson, I don't know, what would you say would be his appeal? What's the appeal with Jefferson?
He wants it his way.
His way, right. Lots of pathos. That's why he gets edited, because he has too much pathos. Plus logos. The logos is the list of the grievances that they had against the king. Then come to a final conclusion about the rhetorical strategies of all three of the founding fathers. So the three together, when you put them together, how would you describe the job they had to do? They have to basically convince a whole area of people, poor people, they need to go to war. Can't be an easy job. So here's your tentative thesis. Were it not for the rhetorical strategies of Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson, finish the statement. What should you say? What do you think would happen if these three gentlemen didn't do what they did?
Most likely today we wouldn't be able to speak freely. We would have to hold back the law. Can't express ourselves without getting executed.
Excellent. Any one of those would work. Yes. So just think about what would happen if they didn't do what they did. Now you have a couple of organizing options here. If you want to break it down by literary devices, or figurative devices, like metaphors, parallelism, and allusions, but we didn't do that much study of them. And if you're not that familiar with them, don't worry about this one. That's just one possible option. I think this one is the more likely of the three that I'm going to give you. You can do this by speaker. So one paragraph would be about Patrick Henry, the next one Thomas Paine, next one Thomas Jefferson. So then you'd add the introduction, conclusion. You have a 5-paragraph essay. Or you could do this by similarities and differences between the two of them. So who is, how are the three men alike in their delivery, and then how are they different in their delivery? Those would be 2 body paragraphs. So with introduction and conclusion, that would be 4-paragraph essay. Would there be any other ways you could think of that you could organize this, how you might approach answering this question?
Maybe if you did like your introduction and then small, like 1 or 2 sentences explaining their backgrounds,
Right?
Like Thomas Jefferson's background, and then start the paragraph off with, he wrote, what did he write? The Declaration. No,
Patrick Henry wrote he gave the speech to the Virginia Convention.
Yeah, so he would start talking about that. And
right.
He feels the process.
Mm-hmm. That would be good, yeah. So if you did kind of like maybe even broke it up. If you think soapstone, the speakers, and then the occasions, and then the audience, you could do that too. So yeah, that would be a really good way to organize it. Good. Don't forget about the conclusion. And one thing about the conclusion, I've been seeing not many, but enough where I want to make sure you understand that you don't put new information in the conclusion. There should be no new evidence there. All your evidence should already have been presented. All the conclusion needs to do is sum up what you've said in the whole essay and reflect what your tentative thesis is, but not repeat it. All right, I did give you a sample body paragraph, and this is not any different than any of the other body paragraphs I've shown you. It still has the same construction. The topic sentence is parallelism works rhetorically to add emphasis to the speaker's thoughts. So that's just, now you know that this paragraph is going to talk about parallelism. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson uses this strategy throughout the document to stress the numerous offenses King George committed against the colonists. Now I've given the detail about how this is coming from Jefferson. Here comes the first piece of evidence. To begin, Jefferson explains why the colonies must revolt from British rule because it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. Now you've got an explanation of that piece of evidence. The repetition of "it is there" strongly makes the statement that the colonists are justified. Now I have a second piece of evidence. Then after the third paragraph, Jefferson begins each following paragraph with the phrase "he has," and it follows with negative verbs such as refused, forbidden, dissolved, and suffered. Now the explanation. There are 20 of these paragraphs that take up approximately half of the document. Now the concluding sentence. Each of these is Jefferson's way of listing all the crimes of King George as the tyrannic sovereign over the colonists. So it's no different from the constructions that we've looked at before. Okay, due dates. First draft is due next Wednesday. So we're having this a little early, this writing lab, because I know this is rigorous text and it's a brand new concept. So I wanted to make sure you had plenty of time, lots of time to ask me questions. The peer reviews will be assigned at midnight on Thursday the 24th, and then they are due Friday. So that way you don't expect it until Friday. If somebody is taking their time with it, they can. That's all I can say. Okay, one more thing, because you guys suffered the turnitin.com last time, and that was kind of a disaster. Don't worry about it. It is set up this time so that you're just turning it directly into Canvas. What I still upload them into Turnitin just for the similarity, and I'm not trying to play gotcha. I'm only trying to see, have you quoted everything correctly? Have you cited it correctly? And if you haven't, then I can point out what you still need to do. So don't worry about turnitin.com. That's done. I complained to the right person, told them this is garbage. I don't like it. So okay, we'll start with Emma. Do you have any questions of anything I've gone over that you would like clarification on?
I don't think so.
Okay. How about you two?
I'm
Nope.
good.
Alrighty then. Well, thank you for coming in. And remember, if you have any questions, inbox, call, whatever you need to do. So thank you very much, Emma. You can go ahead and log out now. And see you later.